My daughter raised her wine glass and smiled the way she always does when she wants everyone in the room to pay attention to her. "And this," she said, turning toward me with that little laugh I'd known her whole life, "is my dad. He used to fix boilers for a living." The table chuckled. Her fiancé's mother, sitting directly across from me, didn't laugh. She set down her fork very slowly, and she looked at me the way someone looks at a word they almost recognize but can't quite place. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, leaning forward just slightly. "Did you say your name was—" She stopped, and the entire table went still. The restaurant was the kind of place where the menus don't have prices. Tucked into a converted Victorian brownstone in the annex neighborhood of Toronto, all exposed brick and low candlelight, and servers who introduced themselves by first name. My daughter had chosen it because her fiancé's family had suggested it. His family suggested a lot of things. I'd arrived early, which is a habit I've had since I was 22 years old, and showed up late to my first job interview. I parked my truck on a side street, the same gray half-ton I'd driven for the past 6 years, and sat for a moment before going in. I looked at my reflection in the visor mirror. The suit I was wearing was dark navy, bought off the rack at a Bay Street men's shop about 4 years ago for my sister's funeral. It still fit well enough. I had pressed it that morning on the kitchen table because my iron board had a wobbly leg I hadn't gotten around to fixing yet. There's a kind of irony in that, I suppose. A man who spent 35 years fixing other people's problems and couldn't be bothered to fix the leg on his own ironing board. Inside, the hostess led me to a long table near the back of the restaurant. My daughter and her fiancé hadn't arrived yet. Her fiancé's parents were already seated, and they stood to greet me with the easy confidence of people who eat at places like this every week. His father reached out a hand. "You must be Eleanor's dad." "That's right," I said. "Pleased to meet you." His mother smiled warmly enough. "We've heard so much about you. That's always a strange thing to hear when you're not sure what exactly your daughter has said." We sat and made the kind of conversation people make when they're waiting for the actual event to begin. The weather, the neighborhood, how long I'd driven in from. I told them I lived in Hamilton. His mother nodded politely in the way people sometimes do when Hamilton is mentioned, and they've never been there, and don't particularly intend to go. Eleanor arrived 20 minutes later, her fiancé behind her. She looked beautiful. She always does, in a dark green dress, her hair pulled back. Her fiancé, a tall young man who worked in commercial real estate, wore a suit that probably cost more than my truck payment. They looked, as people say, like they belonged together. His name was Philip. His parents were Constance and Arthur Whitmore, and the Whitmore family owned a mid-sized property development company that had been building condominiums and mixed-use towers across southern Ontario for nearly 3 decades. They were, by any reasonable measure, quite comfortable. Eleanor sat beside me and squeezed my hand once under the table. A check-in. I appreciated it. For a while, the evening moved pleasantly. Wine was poured. Minutes were studied. Someone asked about the wedding venue. Constance Whitmore talked about a property they owned in Muskoka that would be beautiful in September. Eleanor's eyes lit up. I watched all of this quietly and thought about how much my daughter had grown and how far she'd traveled from the small bungalow in Hamilton where I'd raised her mostly by myself after her mother passed. Then Eleanor's friend, a woman named Joanne who'd come as a kind of emotional support guest, leaned across the table and asked me what I did for work. This is always the question. "I'm retired now," I said. "I was in building systems most of my career." "Oh," said Joanne, "like trades work?" "Something like that." I took a sip of water. Eleanor jumped in. She was on her second glass of wine by this point, and her voice had the warm, loose quality it gets when she's feeling celebratory. "Dad was a boiler man," she said, smiling. "He used to go into buildings at 2 in the morning when the heat went out. She turned to Philip's parents. He's very handy. Growing up, our house was always a construction zone. That's honest work, Arthur said, with the particular tone people use when they mean to be kind but end up sounding like they're grading a paper. Eleanor laughed. He's being modest, actually. Tell them about the time he rewired the whole basement, Dad. Eleanor. He did it over one weekend, by himself. We had extension cords running through the kitchen for 3 days. She shook her head fondly. He's a one-man operation. The table laughed. I smiled. My daughter wasn't being cruel. I want to be clear about that. She has never had a cruel bone in her body. She was proud of me in the way she understood how to be proud of me, through the small, concrete things I had done with my hands over the years. The broken furnaces, the leaking pipes, the rewired basement. She had never thought to look further than that, and I had never given her reason to. But across the table, Constance Whitmore had gone quiet. She was watching me with an expression I couldn't immediately name. Not dismissive, not curious in a polite way, something more specific than that. The expression of a person running a calculation. Her husband said something to her and she nodded without really hearing him. Dinner was served. Conversation broke into smaller currents. Philip and Arthur talked about an upcoming development project near Waterloo. Joanne asked Eleanor about the honeymoon. I ate my duck confit and listened to the room and thought, as I sometimes do at these kinds of events, that the person nobody notices is often the person who sees the most. At one point, Constance looked up from her plate and said very casually, "You said you were in building systems. What sort of buildings?" "Commercial mostly," I said. "Some institutional, hospitals, a few university buildings." She tilted her head slightly. Mechanical systems, HVAC, all of it eventually. Started in mechanical, moved into operations management. Something shifted in her expression. "How long ago did you retire?" "About 4 years ago." She nodded slowly. Then she picked up her wine and said nothing more. But she kept watching me. After the main course, Eleanor made a little toast. She thanked Philip's family for their generosity and warmth. She talked about how happy she was. She said she was grateful to have 2 families coming together. She introduced her father, me, as the man who taught her that anything worth doing was worth fixing properly. The table clapped. I nodded. Philip leaned over and shook my hand. Then Eleanor added, with a grin, "Just don't ask him about spreadsheets. He's strictly a wrench and duct tape man." Joanne laughed. Arthur chuckled. Even Philip smiled. I kept my expression easy. I've had a lot of practice at that. When dinner wound down and people began looking at dessert menus, I excused myself and stepped outside for some air. The street was cool and quiet, the kind of October evening that arrives in Toronto like a reminder that winter means business. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the brownstone across the road and thought about the heating system inside it. Whether it was forced air or radiant, whether someone maintained it properly, whether the pipes were insulated for the cold months. Old habit. The door behind me opened. It was Constance Whitmore. She pulled her wrap tighter around her shoulders and came to stand beside me. For a moment she just looked at the street. "I owe you an apology," she said. I turned slightly. "For what?" "For not saying something at the table." She paused. I was trying to be certain. "Certain of what?" She looked at me directly. "Your full name is Raymond Kowalski." I waited. "You gave a talk," she said, "in 2009, a facilities operations conference at the Weston Harbor Castle. I was there with my husband." She folded her arms. "You spent 45 minutes explaining why most building failures aren't mechanical failures, they're management failures." A small pause. "I've quoted that talk to my board 3 times since then." The street noise filled the quiet between us. "I remember the conference," I said. She looked at me carefully. Your company was called Kowalski Building Systems. It was. And then it became KBS Infrastructure Solutions. That's right. Which you sold. She said it as a statement, not a question. Partly, I said. Kept a minority stake. Constance was quiet for a moment. Then, KBS manages maintenance operations for 17 Whitmore properties across Ontario. I said nothing. You've been maintaining our buildings, she said slowly, for 8 years. My company has, yes. She laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised. And your daughter has no idea. My daughter grew up watching me fix a furnace at midnight, I said. That's what she knows. That's what I showed her. Constance shook her head slightly, not in disbelief, but in something closer to wonder. Why didn't you say something? Inside. I thought about how to answer that. Eleanor is proud of me, I said. Just not for the reasons she thinks she should be proud of me. I've never wanted to correct that. Constance looked at me for a long moment. That's either very humble or very stubborn, she said. My daughter would say stubborn, I said. She gets that from her mother. We stood there another minute. Then Constance said quietly, My husband needs to know who he's been doing business with, and I think your daughter does too. I didn't argue. I think some part of me had known from the moment she first looked at me across that table that this evening wasn't going to end the way anyone had planned. The following morning, Philip's parents had arranged a brunch at their home in Forest Hill. It was the kind of house you'd see in an architectural magazine. High ceilings, clean sight lines, a kitchen that looked like it had never been used for anything as messy as actual cooking. Eleanor and I drove together. She talked the whole way about the restaurant, the wine, how much she liked Constance, how she thought the evening had gone well. I listened. I agreed where I could. I didn't tell her what had happened on the sidewalk. When we arrived, Constance greeted us at the door with the same calm warmth as the night before. But there was something different in the way she looked at me. A kind of settled certainty. Arthur shook my hand and held it a moment longer than necessary, studying my face. He knew too then. Philip met us in the hall. He looked at me with an expression I recognize as the particular look young people get when they've just received information that rearranges something they thought was fixed. We sat in a large sunlit dining room, coffee and pastries and a bowl of fresh fruit, the kind of brunch that appears effortless and costs someone considerable effort. A few other guests were there. Philip's sister and her husband, a colleague of Arthur's from the development world, and Joanne, who had stayed the night at Eleanor's apartment. For a while it was simply pleasant, but I noticed the way Arthur kept looking at Constance and the way Constance kept glancing at me, and I thought, this is going to happen soon. It happened after the coffee cups were refilled. Arthur cleared his throat and said, in the measured way of someone who has run meetings his whole adult life, I'd like to say something, if everyone doesn't mind. The room settled. Eleanor looked up, curious. Last night, Arthur said, my wife recognized someone at the table. He looked at me, someone she'd encountered professionally years ago. And I think, before we go any further as two families, there's a story worth knowing. Eleanor frowned. What do you mean? Arthur looked at me. An invitation. I set down my coffee cup. I thought about what to say and how to say it, and then I decided to say it the same way I'd said everything important in my life, simply, without decoration. I started working in buildings when I was 22 years old, I said. First job was a maintenance technician at an apartment complex in Hamilton, $12 an hour. My job was to make sure the heat worked and the elevators ran and the pipes didn't freeze. The room was quiet. Eleanor was watching me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in a long time. I spent about 10 years doing that kind of work, I continued. Hands-on. Moving between buildings, learning every system I could. I paused. Then I started writing down what I saw, the patterns, the reasons buildings failed, and the reasons they didn't. And I realized that the problem was never really the equipment. The problem was always the system around the equipment, the scheduling, the staffing, the decision-making. Philip's sister leaned forward slightly. Arthur's colleague from the development world had gone very still. So I built a process, I said. And then I built a company around that process. We called it Kowalski Building Systems. I looked around the table. We started with 3 buildings in Hamilton. By the time I stepped back, we were managing operations for just over 200 commercial and institutional properties across Ontario, Manitoba, and Alberta. The silence was complete. Eleanor said nothing. She was looking at me with an expression I can only describe as the look of someone whose map has just turned out to be wrong. Joanne made a small sound. Philip's sister said quietly, "That's a large company." "It was a good company," I said, "built by good people." I looked at Constance briefly, and apparently for the last 8 years, one of our larger clients has been the Whitmore Group. Arthur let out a breath that was half laugh, half something else. "I've been writing checks to your company for 8 years, he said slowly, "and I've been sitting across from you for 2 days thinking you were a retired tradesman." "I am a retired tradesman," I said. "I just also happened to build something along the way." Eleanor's voice came very quietly from beside me. "Dad." I turned to her. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question wasn't angry. It was smaller than that. The voice of someone who has just realized that a room she thought she knew had a door she'd never opened. "I told you I'd started a business," I said. "When you were about 16, you were in the kitchen doing homework, and I said I was going to try to turn the work into something more formal." She frowned. "I remember you saying you were starting a company." "That's right." "I thought you meant like a small local thing, a few contracts." "It started that way." She stared at me. "Dad, I've been telling people my whole adult life that you were a maintenance man." "I was a maintenance man," I said. "I never stopped being one. I just also learned how to manage a few hundred other ones." There was a moment where the room didn't quite know what to do with itself. Then Constance reached across the table and touched Eleanor's hand very briefly. "Your father," she said, "spent his career doing something most people don't have the patience for. He solved problems nobody wanted to think about until they became emergencies." She paused, and he did it quietly, which is, in my experience, how the best work gets done. Eleanor looked down at the table. I could see her processing it, working through the years, the conversations, the introductions she'd made on my behalf, the fond jokes about the wrench and duct tape man. I didn't rush her. After a while, she looked up at me. "I made you sound small last night," she said. "You made me sound like what you knew," I said. "There's no fault in that." But I was laughing. She stopped. "You were happy," I said. "That's all I saw." She was quiet again. "Then, were you embarrassed when I said that, about the boiler and the duct tape?" I thought about that honestly. "No," I said. "I was proud of those things. I still am. I'd rather be known for fixing a furnace at 2 in the morning than for signing a contract in a boardroom." She looked at me for a long time. Her eyes were bright in a way that told me she was working very hard not to let them spill over. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I really didn't know." "I know you didn't. Why didn't you just tell people?" I turned the coffee cup in my hands. "Because I wanted to know if people would treat me with respect when they thought I was nobody important," I said. "And I learned a lot from that." A pause. "More than I ever learned from the ones who treated me well because of what I owned." Philip spoke then, for the first time. He'd been quiet this whole time in the measured way of someone being careful. "My mother told me last night," he said to Eleanor. "I'm sorry I didn't warn you." Eleanor shook her head. "Don't be." She looked at her father, at me. I think I needed to hear it this way. Arthur's colleague, a man who had been visibly recalibrating since the moment KBS infrastructure was mentioned, leaned across and introduced himself formally, shaking my hand as though we were meeting for the first time, which, in a sense, we were. The brunch resumed. Conversations branched and reconnected. Several people found reasons to sit beside me, ask questions that had nothing to do with the weather or the drive from Hamilton. But the thing I remember most from that morning isn't any of that. It's the moment, about 20 minutes after everything settled, when Eleanor leaned over and rested her head against my shoulder the way she used to when she was 8 years old and tired. "I'm still going to tell people you're a wrench and duct tape man," she said. "Good," I said. She laughed, and for the first time since I'd arrived at that restaurant the night before, the laugh was just hers, easy, warm, not for anyone else's benefit. On the drive home that afternoon, I crossed the QEW with the windows cracked and the heat running low against the October chill. And I thought about my wife, who had died 21 years earlier and who had always understood, better than anyone, that I was most comfortable when no one was watching. She used to say I was the kind of man who did his best work in basements and boiler rooms, away from all the windows. She meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. Some people need the room to be looking at them to feel like what they're doing matters. I never needed that. I just needed the system to work. The heat to come on, the lights to stay on, the building to hold. I've spent my whole life keeping things running that people only notice when they stop, and I have never once considered that a small thing to be. I've been thinking about that dinner table a lot since that night in the annex. Not about the moment Constance recognized me, and not about the look on Eleanor's face when she finally understood. I've been thinking about the drive there, about parking my truck on that side street and sitting alone for a minute before walking in, knowing exactly who I was and having no particular interest in explaining it to anyone. There's something that happens to a person when they spend long enough being underestimated. Either you spend your energy correcting it, or you spend it on the work itself. I chose the work. That was a decision I made somewhere in my 40s and never revisited. Not because I was indifferent to how people saw me, but because I'd learned something that took years to understand. The quality of what you build doesn't change based on whether anyone in the room knows you built it. Eleanor had spent years being proud of me in the only way she knew how to be. The midnight furnace calls, the rewired basement, the wobbly ironing board I never got around to fixing. That version of me was real. It wasn't wrong of her to hold on to it. What happened that morning at the Whitmore house wasn't a correction. It was an expansion. Her map got bigger, that's all. But I keep coming back to something she asked me. She said, "Were you embarrassed?" And I told her no, and that was true, but the fuller answer is that I was watching. I've always been watching. 35 years in buildings teaches you that the systems you can't see are the ones that matter most. The wiring behind the walls, the pressure in the pipes, the character of a person when they believe no one important is looking. I sat at that dinner table as a retired maintenance man from Hamilton, and I saw exactly how people treat someone they've decided doesn't count. I also saw Constance Whitmore, who had built something real herself, and who looked at me across the table with the particular attention of a person who knows that substance doesn't always announce itself. That's the kind of intelligence I respect most. Not credentials, not polish, but the willingness to keep looking past the first impression. What I want Eleanor to take from all of this isn't that her father was secretly important. I don't think that's the right word, and I never have. What I want her to understand is that the respect you give a person before you know what they're worth is the only respect that actually means anything. The rest is just accounting. Raymond Kowalski fixed boilers. He also built a company. Neither of those things is more true than the other. The man who showed up that evening in a pressed suit from his sister's funeral is the same man who signed the contracts. The work was never small. It was only ever invisible to people who hadn't learned yet to look at what holds a building up. I think that's what I most wanted my daughter to see. Not the company, the continuity. The fact that the 22-year-old making $12 an hour and the man sitting at that restaurant table were the same person, shaped by the same belief that if something is worth doing, you do it right and you don't stop until it holds. That belief didn't come from success. It came before success. It's what made success possible, and it's the only thing I'd want to leave behind.